everyone. I'm Abby Hart, a project director with the Nature Conservancy's water program in California. And I'm going to be speaking with you today about habitat and open space within the multi-benefit land repurposing program. So first, I want to start off with an overview of what habitat and open space is in the context of the multi-benefit land repurposing program, or MLRP. Habitat and open space are natural areas that can provide habitat for wildlife, while also providing a whole range of benefits for humans and the communities that might be surrounding these natural areas. It can include everything from permanent habitat that is found in dedicated preserves and set aside for nature, to temporary habitat found in and around farm fields that provides either a passing benefit or a seasonal benefit for different types of wildlife. Habitat or open space can also come in a variety of shapes and sizes. It can be everything from a small strip of habitat along the edge of a farm, or a hedgerow that might harbor habitat or foraging lands for different types of wildlife or pollinators, to something that ranges up to thousands of acres in size that could support a whole population of some species of concern. Habitat can also play a number of different functions in the landscape. It can act as a buffer between agriculture and rural communities, potentially reducing some of the human health risks that might be found from agricultural practices, and it can create socioeconomic benefits for those communities as well. And habitat areas can also be places where tribes could protect historical or cultural resources, or have access to native plants or plants of cultural value that they might incorporate into their livelihoods today. Because we're talking about habitat and open space in the context of MLRP, the goal here really is water savings, or a water benefit. So I wanted to talk about the potential water benefit of these different types of habitat. So first of all, when we're looking at dry upland habitat, like the kind you see in the bubble on the left, one of the primary water benefits of that type of habitat is really reducing consumptive water use. If we're transitioning land out of irrigated agriculture and into this type of habitat, we may need to use irrigation for a very brief period of time to establish some of the plants that we might plant there, some of the native plants that would have been in the region historically. But in an ongoing way, that sort of habitat can be supported entirely by ambient precipitation that occurs in this area. So secondly, if we look at the bubble in the center, we're talking about this temporary habitat that you might find created by cover crops in a annually fallowed field, for example. And some of the water benefits from that come from improving soil health and improving the water retention of those fields. And improving the water retention, we can help ensure that any rain that falls is absorbed in that field. And we can also limit, for example, like flood flows across that field, and encourage water to then instead percolate into the soil there. And finally, if you look at the bubble on the right, we can consider benefits like replenishing groundwater supplies. So this is a picture of a wildlife-friendly recharge basin that provides habitat for migratory birds. And here we're also recharging water on this particular basin. So we're getting wetland habitat benefit, habitat for these migratory birds, and we're replenishing groundwater supplies. And if you look at the bottom of the screen, I have indicated that all of these types of habitats can mitigate flood risks depending on where they're positioned in the landscape. So if we can situate habitat, whether temporary or permanent, around waterways or where areas that we know are at risk of flooding, or that could be used to prevent floods from impacting a community, for example, or higher value agricultural lands, any of these areas could be flooded temporarily or during a particularly high water event, and give an appropriate place to take on water, and in doing so provide an additional benefit to communities in the area. So the other primary benefits that we wanted to talk about in the context of MLRP are benefits to growers and landowners in the areas. What can these types of habitat uses do for a landowner? I think in many cases, habitat may eventually find its way into the hands of particular types of landowners, like a conservation organization or even the state or federal government. But to the extent that these habitat lands are held by private landowners or growers, they can provide these functions like reducing consumptive water use. So if a grower decides to transition a certain percentage of their portfolio, they could completely reduce the consumptive water use of the percentage of their land that they transition to habitat, and then dedicate that water allocation to the rest of their property. And like I mentioned with the temporary habitat, those benefits to soil health or water retention that might come from cover cropping or annual fallowing, those can accrue anywhere on their property. Recharging water through a groundwater recharge basin that they might put on their property could enhance their own personal groundwater supply. And because of leave behinds is also going to be benefiting the basin in general. And they can also support their community in managing these flood risks or their own property by like positioning either a basin or habitat to protect the remainder of their property from flooding in a high water event. So what are some of the benefits to other stakeholders in the area? Well, especially when we're thinking about some of the communities in the area, habitat and open land can provide improvements to air and water quality. We can also position habitat to protect community water supplies, so putting them around community well fields to ensure that those well fields aren't within the cones of depression of neighboring agricultural wells, or to encourage recharge to be happening in close proximity to those wells. And then also the Tule Subbasin has some existing habitat areas and open lands, but in general, the San Joaquin Valley actually has relatively little open and green space for communities to use. So habitat and open space can provide important recreational, aesthetic, or tribal cultural values that can benefit communities in the subbasin. So now I'm going to walk through each type of habitat one by one and explain a little bit more about it. When we're talking about arid or upland habitat, the picture that you see on the screen is a good example of that. This picture is actually from the Carrizo Plain, but it's the same sort of habitat that you would find historically in upland parts of the San Joaquin Valley. And when I say upland, I don't really mean that far up in terms of elevation, just areas that wouldn't historically have been part of the waterways and wetlands, like not the Tulare Lake bed or not some of the historical riparian corridors. But these days, really because of the scarcity of water in this landscape, we find that this upland or arid habitat can be positioned in most places, and you get this reduction of consumptive water use and this type of habitat that actually is associated with many threatened and endangered species. It's a habitat type that's rare and is extremely critical to restore if we want to recover some of the populations that historically were present in the San Joaquin Valley. And then this map indicates some of the areas that are suitable for those species. So if you look at this map, the darker green areas are most suitable for upland or arid type habitat, and the lighter green areas are still suitable, but less so. And that has to do both with the proximity of these areas to existing protected areas and also existing populations of species that can use this habitat, as well as just some of the background mapping data that we have on where these species historically occurred and the suitability of like soil and other biotic and abiotic factors in the landscape for these species. And next, we're going to look at wildlife-friendly recharge. And this picture here is an example of wildlife-friendly recharge. When we're talking about wildlife-friendly recharge, we're generally talking about recharge basins that are designed to provide wetland habitat, which could include vegetation, like wetland vegetation, or we're talking about deeply or shallowly flooded fields or basins that can provide habitat for migratory birds. So if it's deeply flooded, it's going to be most suitable for waterfowl like ducks and geese. If it's shallowly flooded, it might be more suitable for other types of birds like shorebirds. So both types of habitats are needed or desirable, and managing for these different depths can present different challenges for landowners. So it's sort of up to each person to decide how they might want to manage their basin. One of the important factors, though, is that actually areas that are most suitable for wildlife-friendly recharge may not be the fastest recharging lands. So, for example, a parcel that recharges water super quickly is actually going to sink that water so fast that we won't get much of a lasting wetland benefit. So what we want for wildlife-friendly recharge are to target lands that are actually kind of moderately suitable for recharge, where the water does slowly percolate back down into the aquifer, but at the same time, the water is pooling on the surface long enough to provide that habitat for these species that we're targeting here. So if you look at this map, you see here suitability of soils for traditional groundwater recharge, and the purple indicates the most suitable areas and the blue indicates highly suitable areas. So for wildlife-friendly recharge, we actually are looking most likely more in these blue areas, not in the purple areas. We don't want that water sinking super fast. We want it to sit on the surface for a little while to make sure that the species have time to use it. Okay, and then now we're going to talk about wildlife-friendly cover cropping. So this picture is just of some blackbirds in, I would say, a really dense, really densely grown in field. But with wildlife-friendly cover cropping, what we're looking to do is reduce consumptive water use. So generally speaking, we're not advocating for landowners to be irrigating these cover crops, but rather to just time the seeding of the cover crops as best they can with the start of the water year and precipitation coming in the fall and winter. And we might recommend a mix of species that provide both some structure and some open grassland habitat to encourage different bird species, especially to come in and use these areas for nesting or foraging. It can also be the case that the timing of when that crop could be either terminated or harvested, or how that sort of end of life cycle, if that cover crop is managed, also can be meaningful for the species or impact birds. So there's often like direction on when exactly to be terminating that crop, but we do get some benefits to different bird species of concern. So I wanted to mention that program as well. And then finally, to wrap up my piece of the presentation, I wanted to give you an example of a habitat project that's already underway in the Tule Subbasin, and really the first of its kind in this area. It's the Caponero Creek project. And I say the first of its kind because this project is really one of the first properties under Sigma to have gone from a transition of a working dairy to then be retired and to now be moving into upland habitat restoration. There are some other restoration projects in the area, but they didn't really happen in this Sigma context where we're really thinking about it in terms of the water benefit and how to be transitioning land in ways that provide multiple benefits, both from the water perspective and to communities in the area. So this property, one of the reasons why it was strategic is that it's positioned on the northwest corner of the Pixley National Wildlife Refuge, an area that we already know hosts many upland species. And so adding 500 some acres of upland habitat to that habitat area could be beneficial for species that are there. So on the map here, you see areas that are blue, yellow, and red, and all of these areas are ones that are going to be restored back into upland habitat. And actually in the fall of this year, fall of 2024, they're going to be planting native plants across an area that's already been cover cropped with annual grasses. So those annual grasses that went in previous years are the annual grasses that are found already commonly across this landscape. And part of the reason why we did that is that we want those annual grasses to compete against any weed species that may be there, and to provide this background palette into which we're going to plant the native seeds in the fall. And the native seeds are really to bring different types of functions into the landscape, whether that's a certain type of structure that we need, like shrubs that can provide both shade and be like digging their roots in a particular way that some of the species like, or forbs that attract certain pollinators and things like that. So the plant selection was made for the benefit of different species that we hope will come and occupy the property eventually. One of the other reasons that I like to highlight the example of Caponero Creek is that, there's a lot of fear around the transition of land in this subbasin, especially because of the amount of land that eventually needs to find its way into other land uses. I wanted to mention this, and that the family that sold the dairy that this Caponero Creek property was originally part of sold their dairy for completely logical reasons for their family. It was an older farmer whose children did not want to take over the farming operation. And so they chose to sell their operation actually to an investment firm. And that investment firm, once they owned the dairy, they had in mind to reconfigure the property to various uses that suited their profitable needs. And they sort of happily reconfigured that dairy into those other land uses and determined that this middle piece wasn't a portion that was going to be particularly profit making for them, and they would be happy to sell it to a conservation landowner. And TNC was able to work with the irrigation district and the Tule Trust to ensure that the irrigation district could hold it in the interim while the Tule Trust and TNC worked on getting the public funding necessary to support the acquisition and restoration of the property. And the reason why I mentioned this history is just that I just want folks to know that it's not always this painful process. Sometimes it makes sense to a landowner to be letting go of a property, or to an investment firm to be making a profitable decision, or to a conservation buyer to buy a piece of property that's very near existing habitat. And I think this project is a great example of decisions that made perfect sense for each of the actors along the way, to the benefit of everyone in the subbasin. And the habitat restoration itself is going to be happening in a way that doesn't use irrigation on the property long term, although we may use irrigation briefly to establish the plants that go in the fall. But in general, the water savings from this basin will benefit from this project will benefit the entire subbasin. And just to give you a sense for what this property looks like, on the left, you see it after the initial cover cropping was terminated. These were forage fields for the dairy. And then in the middle, you see the cover crop coming up. And on the far right, you can see some students that were helping do data collection out on site and seen. One of the other Tule Subbasin MLRP partners has been active and with some of the local schools in bringing students out to Caponero Creek to conduct water quality and soil monitoring. So with that, I'm going to pass the baton on to Letty, who will finish the presentation today. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time.
Hi, I'm going to talk about buffers, also known as revitalization zones, around agricultural disadvantaged communities of the San Joaquin Valley. Rural disadvantaged communities of the San Joaquin Valley experience disproportionate exposure to pesticides, nitrate leaching, and nitrogen gas emissions. But these health threats to the communities can be reduced and even reversed with multi-benefit land repurposing. Now, how can multi-benefit land repurposing help? Consider a revitalization zone of 1 mile around the 123 smallest rural disadvantaged communities of the San Joaquin Valley. In there, it is used approximately 11 million pounds of pesticides. The nitrate leaching to the local aquifers reaches almost 200 million pounds. And the heat-trapping gas emissions emitted by fertilizers are equivalent to 400,000 cars. That's why scientific studies, communities, and other groups that include farmers are supportive of creating revitalization zones around agricultural disadvantaged communities. And the idea consists of repurposing agriculture inside and around rural disadvantaged communities to create a physical separation area that can act as a pesticide-free and nitrate-free belt to protect the community residents, their groundwater aquifer, and their air quality. And these revitalization zones can bring activities that produce positive side effects, such as habitat, renewable energy combined with wildlife corridors, clean industries to promote more socioeconomic opportunities, education, and even training for farm workers who have to change careers. And in the end, this can save water and bring environmental and social resilience for the region and the San Joaquin Valley by generating multiple benefits with multiple uses of the soil. And there are specific incentives for small and medium farmers to adopt climate and ecologically smart transitions, such as the Department of Agriculture, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, the NRCS, has an environmental quality incentives conservation program that helps farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners integrate conservation into working lands. And the NRCS works one-on-one with producers to develop a conservation plan that outlines conservation practices and activities to help solve the on-farm resource issues. And then the producers implement practices and activities in their conservation plan that will then lead to cleaner water and air, healthier soils, and better wildlife habitat, all while improving their agricultural operations. And the Environmental Quality Incentives Program helps producers make conservation work for them. And the financial assistance for practices may be available through this program. And some producers may also qualify for advance payment. There are other programs like the California Department of Food and Agriculture has the Healthy Soils Program Incentives Grant, which is a collaboration of state agencies and departments that promotes the development of healthy soils on California's farmlands and ranchlands. And the Healthy Soils Program Incentives Grant provides financial incentives directly to California growers and ranchers to then implement conservation management practices that can sequester carbon, reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases, and even improve soil health. When we look at the Tule Subbasin and the land uses, in purple you can see cow feed for the dairies mostly on the northwest. In the blue you can see grapes on the south near Delano, and there are citrus orchards in the east. Here you can also see the disadvantaged communities, which are basically all the communities in the subbasin. Around each community, you can see a dashed line that represents a 1 mile zone. This is a zoom into some of the communities. And as you can see, each community is surrounded by different crop types that have different impacts. Therefore, cropland repurposing around each community needs to be tailored considering the unique local features, the issues and strengths, and crop-producing plans with the local communities can make these projects more likely to succeed. For example, this is Allensworth. The Allensworth Progressive Association is a nonprofit organization that runs the government of the township. They're developing a large project of land repurposing to transform this area into a regenerative agriculture hub, with multiple different opportunities that will decrease the water footprint while increasing economic opportunities, the green areas, education opportunities, and the well-being of its residents. Now, about the land they may not be able to repurpose, such as the pistachios on the south, they're negotiating with the landowners, who are a Canadian insurance company with $1 trillion in assets, and their negotiations include better agricultural practices to decrease the use of pesticides, groundwater pollution, and dust. Allensworth Land Repurposing Plan includes a community-wide project to convert Allensworth into a regenerative agriculture hub that can be a very good reference of the potential land uses for this region. Regenerative agriculture itself can increase significantly the water volume stored in the soil, reducing the need for groundwater pumping. It also improves water and air quality for the community while preserving the agricultural identity. And so Allensworth is really an out-of-the-box thinker. The Socio-Environmental and Education Network's SEEN is currently helping the community develop a summer agrivoltaics project for students. These agrivoltaic systems integrate solar energy production and agriculture in the same land at the same time, with multiple benefits and more economic and water resilience. And these agrivoltaic systems can also decrease significantly the water use of agriculture. Also, Allensworth is in the process of purchasing land to create an educational farm based on agroecology. And so this farm will have a market center to sell locally grown produce and artisan goods made by the residents. There will be housing for visitors who travel to Allensworth to learn from local tradespeople, and they will also be creating a childcare cooperative for small farmers and farm workers to lower the barriers to entry and be successful in farming. If you're interested in incorporating aspects of the land use alternatives, for more information on upland and arid habitat restoration, contact the Nature Conservancy. For more information on wildlife-friendly recharge basins, check out the Environmental Defense Fund's or EDF's Building Multi-Benefit Recharge Basin Guides, or contact Audubon. For more information on buffer zones around communities, participatory science, and water and air quality monitoring, contact SEEN, the Social Environmental and Education Network. And for more information on permanent conservation, refer to that solution summary.